Last year, my biggest project was pulling together my reasons for thinking that Matthew was written in Hebrew. It has been edited and added to a few times since then, but even the first version of my primary collection of evidence was over 15,000 words. Past that, there was also a set of supporting documents about the traditional history of the Gospel writers, the Masoretic text, and the textual features I'm adding to my transcription of my primary text. This leaves some people with a very glaring question: what's the best evidence from Matthew in Hebrew? I hate this question. Different kinds of evidence speak to different people. I get what those who ask this question are asking. It's a very long document, and if there's a way to just skip to the good parts, the one silver bullet that will show the answer, then they don't have to read the whole thing. The problem is, I've spoken with dozens of people who have found it interesting. Many of them have told me what spoke to them. There has not been one standout section. So I'll gladly tell you what I personally find most convincing, but it may not speak to you. My defense of Hebrew Matthew is intended to be a holistic discussion of the topic, not a one-shot gotcha. That's part of the reason I originally restricted myself to asking if it's Hebrew or Greek. In later edits I added a few points that turned me away from an Aramaic source, but I mostly put Aramaic to one side because comparing every wordplay 3 ways instead of 2 would make the document a third longer, and no one wants that. Least of all me. For me, the most convincing evidence is that Hebrew Matthew suggests a complete, unified theory that includes and explains all the data, including the synoptic problem, early church testimony, apparent assimilation in the Greek text compared to the SDM family, linguistic elements in Hebrew both in dialogue and structural parts of the Gospel, and linguistic patterns in the Greek edition of Matthew's Gospel. The theory of Greek primacy has to dismiss the early church fathers, has to imagine an unknown Q Gospel to explain the synoptic problem, can explain the apparent assimilation in the Greek edition when compared against the SDM family, and has to ignore the Hebrew linguistic elements especially in the structural parts of the Gospel of Matthew. To me, that's the best evidence. But it's dependent on all the rest. So that doesn't actually help the people that want to shorten their reading schedule and still give my theory a fair shake. To that end, my explanation of how Hebrew Matthew helps solve the synoptic problem is much shorter. It isn't really evidence for or against Matthew in Hebrew on its own, but it's a shorter document that can give a hint of why Hebrew Matthew makes sense in the scope of church history and the development of the Gospels. To those that want more direct evidence, I start with the testimony of the early church. The early church could be wrong, and I think I give good reasons to think they were wrong in thinking that Matthew was written first. Therein is the clue, though: a unified theory of gospel development that incorporates more data wins. The early church wasn't just wrong about the order, it makes sense that they could be wrong because the window of opportunity for writing the first 2 gospels overlaps. It's all part of the overall theory. The testimony of the early church is the most obvious thing that the Greek primacy theory has to just hand-wave away. They say Papias and Jerome and missionaries to India and so on were just wrong. They just sweep it under the rug. The next most convincing point is the linguistic elements that are part of the structure of the document. The linguistic elements in dialogue matter more in the conversation about whether Matthew was written in Hebrew or Aramaic. That's not my main point. There are linguistic elements in the SDM family that are not part of dialogue or wouldn't make sense in a back translation at all. These include Chapter 8 verse 32, the alliteration.
בשר ובסעיף.
Chapter 9 verse 9 versus Chapter 10 verse 13. The Hebrew text spells the name, Matthew, different in these 2 places, but the Greek does not. Chapter 12 verses 14 through 16. There's a wordplay between
פרושים.
and.
פרסם.
Chapter 21 verse 12. There's a wordplay in.
שולחנות השולחניים.
These cases can't be explained by a Semitic background to the people in the text. I go into more detail on each of these in the evidence document, but I don't get points for making the TLDR longer than 1,000 words. The last set of evidence here are the cases of assimilation in the Greek text. It is a well-established guide in text criticism that when there are parallel passages in 2 Gospels, and the readings in one of the Gospels are split between matching the other and a unique reading, the unique reading gets a bump in its likelihood. I catalog 4 instances of what appear to be assimilation in the Greek text, and that's more likely if the Hebrew text is original. These are at chapter 3 verse 11, chapter 8 verse 32, chapter 10 verses 1 to 4, and chapter 27 verse 46. There are 2 cases of possible assimilation going the other way at chapter 7 verse 1 and chapter 9 verse 25, but I address them in their place. The nature of these when compared to the others makes them less likely to suggest Greek as the original language. The other evidence I offer is real. I never know what will speak to someone, so I've built a robust case. I understand if these short cases don't speak to you. We're all different. If there's a different set of evidence that speaks to you personally after reading the whole document, whether that's in favor of the Greek or the Hebrew, let me know in a comment.